talk a little bit about what it takes to construct one of these test plans. As I said, there is no one size fits all universal plan. I've said this many times now through the class. Some projects are massive testing efforts. Some, we're just changing a few little things. I've been on projects that had 0 lines of code changed and tested absolutely everything that happened in the system because there was some upgrades happening to vendor products. We're going to upgrade the version of the core solution, and we need to test everything to make sure nothing broke. I've been a part of projects that had a whole bunch of code changed, but it was very isolated to a specific module, and so there's just a high-level regression test on everything else. So we need to plan our tests not just off of what the requirements say, but what our imaginary project is going to be saying as well. So you need to be specific to come up with a good test plan. It needs to be customized not only to what features are there, but what phase of development are those features. Are some of them built already? Or are some of them brand new? Are you adding functionality to it? What is the nature of the system? Who's involved? What's the nature of this project? The easiest might seem to be a greenfield project where everything's brand new because there's less things to figure out, but then there's more testing that needs to happen. The more realistic is, I have a system that's been out there for 10 years. I want to add in a mobile app because we've never had a mobile app anymore. So what do I want to do for the mobile app? Well, I want to blah, blah, blah. That would be a more interesting and realistic test project. So if you're coming up with something that's super mission critical, your Department of Defense, most data warehouses probably are not super mission critical. They tend to be offline data and whatnot. They're important, but it's not like the system's going to break down if the warehouse isn't working properly. Then you need to be much more rigorous in your testing and have many more permutations and test cycles and whatnot. Some projects, as I said, they can be less so. If you have an existing data warehouse and I'm going to just basically create a new analytics project to be able to predict in our horse supplies company what the new fashion trends for saddles going to be next year based off of the types of food and advertising that's being successful in your sales. I don't know, making something up. That's probably a quick sweep. I mean, it's like, okay, well, let's just run the report, make sure it works based off of that, make sure the logic, it could be less. For this class, your project can't be too simple because there's a lot being asked for you to do. It shouldn't be too complex because you want to be able to get something and get done without spending ridiculous amounts of time for this. So one of the easiest ways to construct your plan is going to say everything's going to be done independently. All the verification validation is going to be done by somebody else other than the developer. Makes it expensive, makes it a lot to track. It's not super realistic, but again, you can determine if the developer is going to do some of the work or the tester is going to do some of the work. It's not super important to what we're doing, but it's something to consider as far as how the plans are going to be documented. The more developers are going to be involved, the more you want them to document things so it's repeatable later on. You don't want them just like, I know how this works, because you'll never capture that again anyplace else. If testers are involved, then you're still going to be capturing something externally, but you can kind of assume some level of expertise. You don't have to have your testers assume that they don't know anything. One thing you want to consider in your test project, and you can use judiciously, is cost and budget. You could say, like, hey, we would love to unit test every line of code, but there's not time or money for that. Budgets can be tight. Quality is important, but we have to be realistic that horse supplies are important, but if something doesn't get ordered on time, the horse can go off and eat some grass. They're not going to starve over that. I'm obsessed with this horse supply example, I guess. But it's a good example, so we'll keep running with it. And then understand that your plan is going to be something that's customized. It's going to be something that's very specialized towards you. And so let's look at some different ways we can customize each of the testing phases we just talked about. So we talk about unit testing. It's, yay, it should be done. It's great. We always want to do unit testing. But again, it's not always going to test more stuff. If I have very detailed requirements, it's not going to add anything more than the requirements are already telling me. If the implementation doesn't really matter, as long as the requirements are met, I don't care how it gets done. It's not a secure feature. I mean, I'm just showing you, IMDb, the movie database out there. If a link is broken, it's not going to be the end of the world. It's not like you're paying money for it anyway. So if it doesn't work for something internally, I'll figure it out eventually. It doesn't have to be tested, at every level if it doesn't show up as a requirements fail. So you can compromise by doing some of the testing in other phases. You can, have other people come in, bring some contractors who are cheaper in or something like that. Do it at a later time. Maybe you don't do it right now, you do it later on. Integration testing, the biggest reason to do that is because it's complicated and there's a lot of integration to get done. And at least you put a place where you have all the people who need to be there at one time and figure out the integration. You can figure out where the problems lie and get them fixed right away and budget the time for that. Realistically, most projects don't have that much integration. Software integrates a lot easier these days than it once did because we have more common protocols, like WSDL and web services and the internet and stuff like that than when we used to have serial ports and all sorts of difficult things there. And so I can often work around not needing to do lots of detailed integration tests. Functional testing, you have to do it. It's the part of the application. The only thing I care about is the only reason I really do testing is because of requirements, and so there's no getting around functional testing. I can often speed it up by putting it into phases, testing things at different times, testing mission critical things first, and then prioritizing requirements of what's nice to have. So yes, I sure would love this feature to work. If it doesn't, I can still ship it and make this feature work later on. Because remember, testing is not just about making a perfect system, it's also making money. If I have a perfect system that takes 20 years to release, I might run out of money before it's perfect. So I sometimes have to release something, start making some money, and then make it better as it goes. Performance testing. Hey, it doesn't matter how great your functionality is if it breaks down. If I have the best game ever, but more than 5 people log in and the system crashes, I can't get more than 5 people to pay for it at a time, right? So I need to figure out a way to make my functionality work in many environments, and that's where performance testing comes in. Not just does it perform, but when will it break down? You don't necessarily need everything to perform well all the time. You just need it to perform better than the demands of which it's asking for. And if it's going to break down, you give it some prediction of when it will. Many video games, online games, they just have multiple servers, and they only allow a certain number of people to log in. And then you have to get redirected to another server. And that's the way they manage the performance aspects of it. And so you can compromise by doing different types at different times. You can hope for the best and maybe nothing will break. There's all sorts of different ways you can talk about this. In your projects, you might mention performance testing. I'm not going to use that as a criteria that it absolutely must be there in perfect form, but it'd be nice to talk about it and get some feel for it. Regression testing is something that would fit in, depending on your plan, as probably a later phase. Or you could have a whole project be focused around regression testing. The most important thing for regression testing is it needs to be put in a context. You need to do regression testing anytime something changes to at least make sure you're spot checking everything. But sometimes you can say, hey, we don't need to test this because the experts agree that just because I changed the login feature, it's not going to change the database table structure. Yeah, I can agree with that. And it might change the permissions though. So there's all sorts of things you might want to consider inside of there. Then post-release testing, well, that's something that's always a nice to have, but isn't always critical. Sometimes I just trust that my software is going to work. It's worked at every release so far. Sometimes it's the first time I've released something. So hey, if it worked in all the test environments, why wouldn't it work in this environment? But it's something that it's nice to do when you can.